20 years ago, a young boy watched his father, a dedicated cop, murdered in cold blood by the very men sworn to protect. Now, that boy has become FBI agent Micah Gaines, ready to uncover the truth and face the powerful figures who hid in the shadows. But as he gets closer, a chilling message emerges. The Harbinger is watching. Who is pulling the strings? And how far will Micah go to honor his father's memory and take down the mastermind behind it all? Stay tuned for a story of justice, vengeance, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun reflected off the glassy surface of Silver Willow Lake, its ripples sparkling like diamonds. The air was filled with the soft rustle of leaves swaying in the breeze and the occasional chirp of birds. Leroy Gaines adjusted his fishing line, the click of the reel breaking the tranquil silence. His 10-year-old son, Micah, sat cross-legged beside him, his oversized hat slipping down over his eyes as he fiddled with the bait box. "Think we'll catch anything, Dad?" Micah asked, pushing the hat back up with a grin. Leroy chuckled, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Maybe, kiddo. But you know what? It's not really about the fish." He ruffled Micah's curls, earning a playful swat from his son. Micah scrunched his nose. "Then what's it about?" "It's about this." Leroy gestured around them, his broad hand sweeping across the lake, the trees, and the quiet that seemed to wrap around them like a blanket. "Moments like these, just you and me, away from the noise." Micah nodded, though he didn't fully understand. For him, this was an adventure, a chance to be like his dad, the coolest person he knew. Leroy Gaines wasn't just a father, he was a protector, a symbol of everything strong and good. Micah idolized him, hanging on every word, every smile, every piece of advice. As they sat in companionable silence, the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Leroy stretched, his large frame casting a long shadow over the dock. "All right, kiddo, let's pack it up. Your mom'll have my hide if we're late for dinner." Micah groaned, reluctant to leave. "Just a little longer? Please?" Leroy hesitated, his resolve softening at the sight of Micah's pleading eyes. He sighed, setting his fishing rod down. "All right, 5 more minutes. But then we're out of here. Deal?" "Deal," Micah beamed, his face lighting up with a joy that made Leroy's chest tighten. He lived for moments like this, for the innocence in his son's eyes, the laughter that felt like sunlight on a cold day. But beneath it all, a shadow lingered in his mind. His job as a police officer wasn't just demanding, it was dangerous. And lately, he'd been sensing something. Off. The quiet was broken by the sound of rustling leaves. Leroy's sharp instincts kicked in, his head snapping toward the tree line. His hand instinctively moved to his hip, but he wasn't armed. Not here, not during a moment meant for peace. "Micah," Leroy said, his voice low and firm, "stay close to me." Micah froze, his wide eyes darting to the trees. "What's wrong, Dad?" Before Leroy could answer, 2 men stepped out from the shadows. Their faces were obscured by black ski masks, their movements purposeful. Leroy's heart dropped. This wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery. He recognized the deliberate strides, the chilling calmness. These men weren't amateurs. They were here for him. "Run, Micah," Leroy whispered, his voice trembling with an urgency Micah had never heard before. "Hide. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "But now!" Leroy's voice rose, sharp and commanding. Micah bolted, his small legs carrying him toward the brush as his heart pounded in his ears. He crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, peering through the leaves. His hands shook as he clamped them over his mouth, trying to silence his panicked breaths. Leroy stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared, his towering frame blocking the men's view of where Micah had run. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the dread clawing at his chest. The taller of the 2 men raised a gun, pointing it squarely at Leroy's chest. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Gaines." Leroy's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, his hands raised slightly. "If this is about money, I can make it right. Just not here." My son doesn't need to see this. The shorter man laughed, a cold, hollow sound. It's not about money. It's about what you know. Before Leroy could respond, the gun went off. The crack of the shot shattered the serene air, sending birds screeching into the sky. Micah flinched, biting down hard on his lip to stifle a cry as he watched his father stagger back, clutching his side where blood blossomed across his shirt. Leroy fell to his knees, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The taller man stepped closer, pulling off his mask. Leroy's eyes widened, recognition flashing across his face. "You," he croaked, but the words wouldn't come. The man leaned down, his expression unreadable. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, his voice almost regretful. He raised the gun again and fired twice more. Micah clamped his hands tighter over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. He wanted to scream, to run to his father to stop this, but his legs wouldn't move. The men turned, disappearing into the trees as quickly as they had come, leaving behind only silence. Micah waited, his small body trembling with fear and grief. When he was sure they were gone, he crawled out of the bushes and stumbled to his father's side. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Dad, please." Leroy's eyes were half closed, his gaze fixed on something far away. His hand, once so strong and steady, was cold in Micah's grasp. "Don't leave me," Micah sobbed, pressing his forehead against Leroy's chest. The lake, once so peaceful, now felt like a graveyard. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dock as the boy sat there, holding on to the last piece of his father he had left. The rhythmic hum of the city filled the Boston morning as Micah Gaines maneuvered through the crowded sidewalks. The hustle and bustle were a far cry from the stillness of Silver Willow Lake, a place he hadn't visited in 20 years. He glanced up at the towering glass facade of the FBI field office, its reflection fractured by sunlight. For most, it was a symbol of justice and order, but for Micah, it was a battleground. Micah strode into the building, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. His sharp suit and focused demeanor exuded authority, but beneath the surface, a storm brewed. Leroy Gaines' death wasn't just a memory. It was the driving force behind every decision Micah made. The image of his father collapsing, the masked men disappearing into the woods, it all replayed in his nightmares like a broken record. Micah had spent years chasing justice, but the weight of his failure to protect his father never left him. Inside the bullpen, the usual chaos reigned. Agents scurried between desks, phones rang incessantly, and whiteboards overflowed with case notes and timelines. Micah's desk sat in the far corner, organized with military precision, folders stacked neatly, pens aligned perfectly. He dropped his briefcase on the desk and slumped into his chair. His reflection in the monitor stared back at him. Tired eyes, a jawline clenched from years of tension, and faint scars that told their own stories. "Late night?" came a familiar voice. Micah looked up to see Celia Marlowe, his mentor, holding 2 cups of coffee. Her salt and pepper hair framed a face etched with wisdom and weariness. Celia had seen it all, decades of cases that bled into her personal life, each one leaving its mark. She was tough but fair, a grounding force in Micah's chaotic world. "Something like that," Micah replied, taking the cup she offered. Celia sat on the edge of his desk, scrutinizing him with piercing eyes. "You've got that look again." Micah raised an eyebrow. "What look?" "The one that says you're about to dive headfirst into a rabbit hole without a safety net." She sipped her coffee, her tone softer now. "What's going on, Micah?" He hesitated, swirling the coffee in his cup. "A lead came in this morning. Something about a drug ring operating out of Coldridge." Celia's brow furrowed. "Coldridge? That's out of your jurisdiction." "It's also where my father worked," Micah said quietly, his gaze dropping to the desk. Celia sighed, setting her cup down. "Micah, I know how much this means to you, but you can't keep chasing ghosts. It's been 20 years. You've built a life, a career. Don't let the past consume you." Micah leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't just about the past, Celia. The same precinct that covered up my father's murder is tied to this drug ring. I can't ignore it. Celia studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right, but if you're going to dig, make sure you're ready for what you find. That evening, Micah sat in his apartment, his laptop open to an encrypted database. Files on Coldridge Police Department filled the screen, each one a potential thread leading to the truth. His father's face stared back at him from an old precinct photo, strong, confident, alive. Micah's chest tightened. Among the files was a recent report detailing suspicious activity at the precinct. Officers had been clocking in at odd hours, and unregistered vehicles were seen leaving the station late at night. One name stood out. Victor Calloway, the current police chief, and a man with a spotless record on paper. Micah knew better. A spotless record often meant someone was very good at hiding the dirt. As he sifted through the files, a notification pinged on his screen. It was a message from an informant known only as Redbird. Coldridge PD is rotten to the core. If you want answers about Leroy Gaines, follow the money. Micah's jaw clenched. Whoever Redbird was, they had just given him the validation he needed. The next morning, Micah stood in Celia's office. She leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, as he laid out his case. I want the transfer to Coldridge, he said, his tone resolute. Celia didn't respond immediately. She tapped a pen against her desk, her eyes narrowing. You're not asking for a transfer, Micah. You're asking for permission to throw yourself into a hornet's nest. I'm asking for a chance to do my job, he countered. If this ring is tied to my father's death, I need to see it through. Celia exhaled sharply. You're going to do this with or without my blessing, aren't you? Micah nodded. You know I am. Then at least take backup, she said. Coldridge isn't Boston. It's a small town, and everyone knows everyone. They'll see you coming from a mile away. I'll handle it, Micah replied. Celia stared at him for a moment before standing and extending her hand. Just don't forget who you are out there. You're an agent first, not a vigilante. Micah shook her hand, gratitude flickering in his eyes. Thanks, Celia. By the time Micah arrived in Coldridge, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sleepy town. It was a stark contrast to Boston. Quaint streets lined with mom-and-pop shops, a lone diner with flickering neon lights, and the ever-present quiet that felt more oppressive than peaceful. But beneath the surface, Micah felt the undercurrent of something darker. The Coldridge FBI satellite office was smaller than he'd expected, just a modest building tucked between a bank and a post office. Inside, the atmosphere was cordial but wary. Micah met his new supervisor, Special Agent Marcus Flint, a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude. Flint greeted him with a firm handshake and a skeptical glance. Welcome to Coldridge, Flint said, his voice gruff. I heard you requested this assignment. You must like a challenge. Micah smiled faintly. Let's just say I have unfinished business here. Flint raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. We've got a lot of ground to cover. The local PD hasn't exactly been cooperative, so tread lightly. Micah nodded, already scanning the office for anything that might hint at the corruption he sought to expose. His eyes landed on a corkboard filled with photos and notes. Among them was a picture of Victor Calloway, his expression stern and calculated. As Micah settled into his desk, a young officer approached, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Agent Gaines? She asked, extending a hand. I'm Officer Janessa Crowell. I heard you'll be working with us. Micah shook her hand, noting the curiosity in her eyes. That's right. Good to meet you. Janessa hesitated, then lowered her voice. If you're here to dig into the PD, be careful. Not everyone's happy about outsiders poking around. Micah's gaze hardened. Thanks for the warning. As he watched Janessa walk away, Micah felt the weight of the town's secrets pressing down on him. He wasn't just here to do a job. He was here to finish what his father started. The morning air in Coldridge was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Micah sat in his car outside the local precinct, watching as officers filed in and out. It was a quiet town on the surface, idyllic even. But Micah could feel the undercurrent of unease. The smiles were too polite, the glances too wary. Everyone in this town seemed to know something, and nobody was talking. Micah stepped out of his car and adjusted his jacket. His FBI badge clipped conspicuously to his belt. The precinct was a modest brick building, a far cry from the towering offices he was used to in Boston. But he knew better than to let appearances fool him. Corruption didn't need skyscrapers to thrive. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations hushed as Micah walked through the bullpen, his presence an unwelcome disruption. Officers avoided eye contact, their movements hurried. At the far end of the room, a door opened, and Chief Victor Calloway stepped out. Calloway was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair and an air of authority that demanded respect, or fear. His uniform was immaculate, his badge polished to a gleam. He surveyed the room with piercing eyes that landed on Micah. "Agent Gaines," Calloway said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Welcome to Coldridge. I heard we were getting an FBI liaison. Didn't realize it'd be someone so determined." Micah approached, extending a hand. "Chief Calloway, thanks for having me." Calloway's handshake was firm, his grip lingering just long enough to establish dominance. "We don't often get visitors from the Bureau. What brings you to our little town?" "Drug trafficking," Micah replied, keeping his tone neutral. "We've got reason to believe it's connected to this precinct." Calloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's a serious accusation. I hope you've got more than just speculation to back it up." "I'm working on that," Micah said, holding the chief's gaze. "Figured I'd start here." Calloway's jaw tightened ever so slightly before he nodded. "Of course. You'll have full access to anything you need. We've got nothing to hide." As Calloway turned and walked away, Micah's eyes followed him, his gut telling him otherwise. The man's confidence was unsettling, almost rehearsed. Later that day, Micah sat in the small office he'd been assigned. The room was sparsely furnished, a single desk and a file cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. He spread out his laptop and a few case files, determined to dig deeper into Calloway's background. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Micah looked up to see Janessa Crowell, the young officer he'd met the day before, standing in the doorway. She carried a tablet under one arm, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. Micah gestured to the chair across from him. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Janessa sat, her eyes darting around the room before settling on Micah. "You're here about the drugs, right?" Micah nodded. "That's part of it." Janessa leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Then you should know, Calloway isn't just running this precinct. He's running this town. Nothing happens here without his say-so." Micah studied her, noting the tension in her posture and the nervous energy in her voice. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone has to," she said firmly. "People here are too scared to speak up, but I'm not going to sit back and watch this happen." Micah nodded, appreciating her courage. "What do you know?" Janessa hesitated before unlocking her tablet and sliding it across the desk. On the screen was a series of photos. Calloway meeting with a man Micah recognized as the leader of the Iron Hounds gang. The timestamps showed the meetings happened late at night, often in remote locations. "Where did you get these?" Micah asked. "I have a knack for finding things," Janessa said with a small smile. "But it gets worse. Check this out." She swiped to another set of images, this time showing unmarked cars entering and leaving the precinct after hours. "These aren't patrols. They're drop-offs. I've seen it myself." Micah's mind raced as he processed the information. This was exactly the kind of evidence he needed, but it also painted a target on Janessa's back. "You realize what you're risking by sharing this, right?" Janessa met his gaze, her jaw set. "Yeah, but I'd rather risk it than do nothing." Micah nodded, respecting her resolve. "All right, let's keep this between us for now. If Calloway's involved, we'll need more than photos to bring him down." That evening, Micah returned to his motel room, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He opened his laptop, pulling up the files he'd brought from Boston. Among them were fragments of his father's old case notes, scans of handwritten pages filled with cryptic details. Leroy Gaines had been meticulous, but His shorthand wasn't easy to decipher. Micah's eyes caught on a name that appeared several times, the Harbinger. The word was underlined in bold strokes, surrounded by question marks and arrows. Beside it, his father had scrawled, "Who is this? Connection to Calloway?" Micah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Leroy had been onto something big. The Harbinger wasn't just a name, it was a piece of a larger puzzle. But what did it mean? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're digging too deep, Agent. Back off before it's too late." Micah's heart pounded as he stared at the message. The fight wasn't just professional anymore, it was personal. The shadows of Coldridge were closing in, and Micah knew he couldn't trust anyone. Not yet. He stood, pacing the room as the pieces began to fall into place. Calloway's tight grip on the town, the Ironhound's operations, his father's notes, all of it was connected. But to what end? Micah glanced at the file cabinet he'd brought from Boston, then back at the message on his phone. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't here to make friends. He was here for justice, for his father. As the moonlight filtered through the thin motel curtains, Micah sat down again, determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as Micah pulled into the parking lot of the Coldridge FBI satellite office. The town was just waking up, but he'd been awake for hours, poring over Janessa's photos and his father's fragmented notes. The name, the Harbinger, buzzed in his mind like a warning bell, though its meaning remained just out of reach. Inside the office, the team was assembling for the day's operation. Special Agent Marcus Flint stood at the front of the room, reviewing the plan on a whiteboard. The raid on a suspected Ironhound's hideout was their best shot at gaining intel on the gang's operations and, more importantly, their ties to Chief Calloway. Flint nodded at Micah as he entered. "Glad you're here. You're leading the charge on this one." Micah raised an eyebrow. "I thought that was your job," Flint smirked. "You're the one itching to make waves. Just don't get yourself killed." The team was briefed quickly. The Ironhound's hideout was a warehouse on the edge of town, a place that had seen little activity in recent weeks, but remained a known gang stronghold. Janessa had flagged it after noticing unmarked vans entering late at night, and the FBI had enough intel to warrant a raid. It was risky, but Micah knew the only way to uncover the truth was to take risks. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal exterior blending into the surrounding industrial wasteland. Micah gripped his weapon tightly as the tactical team moved into position. The early morning air was thick with tension, the kind that comes before a storm. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Ready!" Flint's voice crackled through the comms. "Ready," Micah replied, his voice steady. With a swift signal, the team breached the entrance. The quiet of the warehouse shattered as boots thundered across the concrete floor and shouts echoed through the cavernous space. The gang members inside scrambled, some reaching for weapons, others trying to flee. Micah moved with precision, his training taking over as he cleared the room. One of the gang members, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, was tackled to the ground and handcuffed. The rest were subdued or cornered, their attempts at resistance futile against the FBI's overwhelming presence. Micah's eyes scanned the space, landing on a metal desk pushed against the far wall. Papers and ledgers were strewn across its surface. He moved quickly, sifting through the documents until he found what he was looking for. A black leather-bound ledger with names, dates, and dollar amounts meticulously recorded. His breath caught as he saw familiar names listed among the transactions, officers from the Coldridge precinct, including Victor Calloway. "Gaines," Flint called, pulling Micah's attention away. "We've got someone you'll want to talk to." Micah turned to see the scar-faced man sitting in a chair, his hands cuffed behind him. The gang member's defiance was clear in his posture, but his eyes betrayed fear. "You've got a lot to answer for," Micah said, crouching in front of him. "Starting with who's paying you to keep your mouth shut." The man smirked, his lips curling in a way that made Micah's stomach churn. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Micah's patience was thin. "Start talking, or you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell." The man leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're following the same path as your old man. You think that's going to end any different for you?" Micah's blood ran cold. "What do you know about my father?" The man laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "He dug too deep, just like you're doing now. They buried him for it. And if you're not careful, they'll bury you too." Micah stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. He felt Flint's hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Take him back to the office," Flint ordered the team. "We'll get more out of him there." Micah nodded, his mind racing. The man's words echoed in his head, stirring a familiar mix of anger and fear. Leroy's murder wasn't just a random act of violence. It had been a warning, and now Micah was receiving the same treatment. Later that afternoon, Micah drove back to the precinct, the ledger tucked securely in his briefcase. He replayed the gang member's cryptic warning in his mind, each word sharpening his determination. He couldn't let fear stop him, not now. As he approached the outskirts of town, a black SUV appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it, but as the vehicle closed the distance, unease crept in. The SUV's tinted windows offered no clues as to who was inside. Micah's grip tightened on the wheel as the SUV sped up, its grille practically kissing his bumper. He glanced around, realizing the road ahead was deserted. His pulse quickened. Without warning, the SUV rammed into the back of his car, sending a jolt through his body. Micah struggled to keep control, the tires screeching as the car swerved. Another hit. This wasn't an accident. "Damn it," Micah muttered under his breath, adrenaline surging. He floored the gas pedal, his car roaring forward, but the SUV stayed close, relentless. The next impact was harder, sending Micah's car skidding toward the edge of the road. The guardrail loomed closer, the drop beyond it steep and unforgiving. Micah made a split-second decision, yanking the wheel to the left. The car spun, tires squealing as it veered into the opposite lane, narrowly avoiding the guardrail. The SUV pulled up alongside him, and Micah caught a glimpse of a masked driver aiming a gun. He ducked as a shot shattered his passenger side window, glass raining down around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he swerved again, forcing the SUV to back off momentarily. Spotting an upcoming turnoff, Micah slammed the brakes and turned sharply, his car skidding onto a dirt path. The SUV struggled to follow, its tires kicking up clouds of dust. Micah used the momentary advantage to regain control, his mind racing for options. The dirt path ended at an abandoned barn, and Micah had no choice but to bail. He jumped out of the car, rolling onto the ground as the SUV screeched to a halt behind him. He sprinted toward the barn, the sound of footsteps and voices behind him spurring him forward. Inside, the barn was dark and cluttered, offering little in the way of cover. Micah ducked behind a stack of crates, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached for his Glock, steadying himself as he heard the men approach. "Spread out," one of them barked. "He's here somewhere." Micah's mind raced. He needed to level the playing field. Spotting an old ladder leading to the rafters, he climbed quickly and silently, positioning himself above the intruders. From his vantage point, he could see two men, their weapons drawn, searching the shadows below. Taking a deep breath, Micah aimed and fired, the shot echoing through the barn. One of the men dropped, his weapon clattering to the ground. The second man shouted in alarm, spinning toward the sound, but Micah was already moving. He leapt from the rafters, landing hard and knocking the man's weapon away. The two struggled briefly before Micah overpowered him, slamming him against a support beam. "Who sent you?" Micah growled. The man sneered. "You already know." Micah didn't get a chance to press further. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder, and the man used the distraction to slip free, fleeing into the shadows. By the time the police arrived, the SUV was gone, and so was its driver. Micah leaned against the barn wall, his chest heaving. This wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until he was silenced, but they'd underestimated him. As Micah walked back to his battered car, he made a silent vow. They wouldn't bury him, not before he exposed every last one of them. The Coldridge FBI office buzzed with activity, but Micah felt like an outsider in his own team. The adrenaline from the ambush still coursed through him as he stepped into the building, his scraped hands clutching the black ledger he'd retrieved from the Iron Hound's hideout. His car was a wreck, his body sore, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. "Rough night?" Marcus Flint's voice carried over the noise as Micah entered the briefing room. Flint leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You could say that," Micah replied, tossing the ledger onto the table with a heavy thud. "I've got proof. Officers tied to Calloway are being paid off by the Iron Hounds." Flint pushed off the wall, walking toward the table. He opened the ledger, flipping through the pages. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the list of names and amounts, but his reaction was far from what Micah expected. "Where'd you get this?" Flint asked, his tone flat. Micah frowned. "Does it matter? It's legit." Flint's jaw tightened. "You're damn right it matters. You're walking into dangerous territory, Gaines. Calloway isn't just some corrupt cop. He's got connections, the kind that make people disappear." Micah's eyes narrowed. "And you're telling me to back off? What happened to chasing justice, Flint?" Flint slammed the ledger shut and glared at Micah. "You think this is a game? You're not in Boston anymore. This is Coldridge. It's different here." The room went quiet, the tension between them palpable. Micah studied Flint, searching for a crack in his armor. There was something off, something he couldn't put his finger on. "I'm not backing down," Micah said firmly. "If Calloway's involved, I'm going to expose him." Flint held his gaze for a moment before turning away. "Just don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face." Micah sat alone in his office, his father's journal spread out before him. The entries were written in Leroy's neat, precise handwriting, but the notes grew more frantic as they approached the date of his murder. Micah traced his finger over a line underlined multiple times. "Iron Hounds funneling money through the precinct. Calloway connected." His heart sank as he turned to the final entries. Leroy had been tracking suspicious activity for months. Officers clocking into unassigned shifts, unexplained cash deposits, and late-night meetings with unmarked vehicles. The pieces were all there, but Leroy hadn't lived long enough to put them together. Micah's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Janessa. "Micah, you need to come to the precinct," she said, her voice urgent. "What's going on?" "I found something big." The Coldridge precinct felt even more suffocating than usual as Micah walked through its halls. Officers avoided his gaze, their conversations ceasing as he passed. The atmosphere reeked of fear and complicity. Janessa met him in a dimly lit office tucked away in the back. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the weight of what she'd uncovered. She motioned for Micah to sit as she turned her computer screen toward him. "I've been going through old surveillance footage from the precinct," she began, her voice shaky. "This is from the night your father was killed." Micah leaned forward, his breath hitching as the video played. It showed Chief Victor Calloway walking into the precinct at 11:45 p.m., hours after his shift had ended. He wasn't alone. 2 men accompanied him, both wearing black ski masks. Micah's stomach twisted as the timestamp aligned perfectly with Leroy's murder. The footage continued, showing Calloway entering a secure room with the masked men. They emerged 30 minutes later, carrying duffel bags. "It doesn't stop there," Janessa said, clicking to another clip. This one showed Calloway and the masked men leaving the precinct. A black SUV waited outside. "That's the same SUV that ran me off the road," Micah muttered, his voice tight with anger. Janessa nodded. "Calloway didn't just cover up your father's murder. He orchestrated it." Micah's fists clenched, his pulse pounding in his ears. Calloway's smug face flashed in his mind, the way he'd brushed off Micah's questions with practiced ease. The man had been playing puppet master for decades, and Micah was finally seeing the strings. "Does anyone else know about this?" Micah asked. Janessa hesitated. "Not yet. I didn't want to risk it." "Good. Keep it that way. This stays between us until I figure out our next move." Micah drove back to his motel, his thoughts a whirlwind. Calloway's betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined, but Flint's behavior gnawed at him. Why was his supervisor so eager to dismiss the evidence? And why did it feel like Flint was trying to protect Calloway? As Micah pulled into the parking lot, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an anonymous message. Trust no one. Micah's grip tightened on the phone. The warning wasn't just paranoia. It was a lifeline. The walls were closing in, and he had no idea who was on his side. That night, Micah pored over his father's journal again, cross-referencing it with Janessa's footage. The connections were undeniable. Calloway had used his position to shield the Ironhounds and eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Leroy had been his first victim, but Micah wouldn't be the last. As the hours ticked by, Micah's resolve hardened. He couldn't trust Flint, and Janessa's life was at risk if anyone discovered what she'd found. He was running out of options, but he wasn't about to back down. Micah closed the journal, his father's words echoing in his mind. The truth will cost you everything. For Micah, the cost was worth it. Tomorrow, he'd confront Flint and force him to choose a side. The antiseptic scent of the hospital room hung heavy in the air as Micah slowly opened his eyes. The harsh fluorescent lights above stung, and his head throbbed with every pulse. He tried to sit up, but his body protested, a sharp pain shooting through his ribs from the crash. "Easy there, Agent Gaines," came a warm voice. A nurse in scrubs stood at the foot of his bed, adjusting the IV. Her name tag read Sandra, and her demeanor was calm and professional. "You took quite a hit. You're lucky to be alive." Micah managed a weak nod, his throat dry. "How long have I been here?" "Just overnight," Sandra replied. "The doctors ran some tests. No major damage, just a few bruised ribs and some minor cuts. You'll be back on your feet in no time." Micah glanced around the sterile room, his FBI-issued briefcase sitting on the chair in the corner. His thoughts immediately returned to Calloway, the Ironhounds, and Janessa's damning footage. Every minute he spent here felt like a wasted opportunity, but his body wasn't ready to move just yet. Sandra gave him a reassuring smile before stepping out, leaving Micah alone with his thoughts. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the crash and the masked men who had tried to kill him. They weren't just sending a warning, they were eliminating threats. The realization settled heavily in his chest. They wouldn't stop until he was dead. A knock at the door pulled Micah from his thoughts. A tall man in a white coat entered, holding a clipboard. His hair was neatly combed, his glasses perched low on his nose, and his smile seemed rehearsed. "Agent Gaines," the man greeted. "I'm Dr. Marshall, just here to check on you." Micah's instincts prickled immediately. He hadn't been told about another doctor, and something about this man felt off. His movements were too deliberate, his smile too practiced. Micah sat up straighter, ignoring the protest of his ribs. "I thought the tests were already done." "Just routine follow-up, doctor." Marshall replied smoothly, stepping closer. His hand dipped into the pocket of his coat, pulling out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Micah's heart rate spiked. "What's that?" "Just a sedative," the man said, his tone casual. "Standard procedure." Micah's mind raced. Every fiber of his being screamed danger. He glanced at the man's hands, noticing the faint tremor as he approached. This wasn't a doctor. This was an assassin. Before the man could make his move, Micah acted on pure instinct. He grabbed the IV pole next to his bed and swung it with all his strength, knocking the syringe out of the man's hand. It clattered to the floor, but the fake doctor recovered quickly, lunging at Micah with surprising force. The two men grappled, the small hospital room becoming a chaotic battlefield. The assassin's grip was strong, his movements calculated, but Micah's adrenaline gave him the edge. He twisted out of the man's hold, slamming him against the bedside table. "Who sent you?" Micah growled, his voice low and furious. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife. Micah barely dodged the swipe, the blade slicing through the air inches from his face. He grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray, and used it to deflect the next attack, the clang of metal on metal echoing in the room. The assassin snarled, his composure slipping. "You should have stayed out of it, Gaines." Micah used the opening to land a punch squarely on the man's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. But the assassin was relentless, coming at Micah again with the knife. This time, Micah caught his wrist, twisting it until the knife dropped. He shoved the man hard, pinning him against the wall. "You're not walking out of here," Micah said through gritted teeth. "Who sent you?" The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're not the only one being watched. Calloway's just the beginning." Before Micah could press further, the assassin drove his knee into Micah's injured ribs, forcing him to let go. The man shoved past him, grabbing the knife as he fled the room. Micah stumbled after him, but his body betrayed him, the pain too much to overcome. When hospital security finally arrived, the assassin was long gone. Micah sat on the edge of his bed, clutching his side, his breath labored. The room was a mess: overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the remnants of the syringe still on the floor. Janessa burst into the room moments later, her face pale. "Micah, what the hell happened?" "An assassin," Micah said, his voice tight. "Posed as a doctor. He was here to finish what the crash couldn't." Janessa's eyes widened. "Did you get anything out of him?" Micah gestured to the ground where the man had dropped a burner phone during their fight. Janessa picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling. "Think this'll lead us anywhere?" "It better," Micah said, leaning back against the wall. "Because they're not just after me. They're after anyone who knows the truth." Later that evening, Micah sat in Janessa's makeshift tech lab, watching as she worked to crack into the assassin's phone. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of encrypted messages. Janessa's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing layers of security until the contents were laid bare. "There," she said, pointing to one of the messages. It read, "Target compromised. Proceed with elimination. Orders from Calloway." Micah's jaw tightened as he read the message. Another string of texts followed, mentioning the Harbinger. One message in particular made his blood run cold. "Gaines is close. Ensure he doesn't get any closer." "They know about you," Janessa said, her voice trembling. "They're watching everything." Micah leaned back, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Calloway wasn't acting alone. Whoever the Harbinger was, they were orchestrating this from the shadows, pulling strings that went far beyond Coldridge. "This changes everything," Micah muttered. "We're not just dealing with a dirty cop, we're dealing with an entire network." Janessa looked at him, her resolve hardening. "What's the plan?" Micah's eyes burned with determination. "We cut off the head of the snake. Calloway's the key. We bring him down and the rest will follow." As the night wore on, Micah couldn't shake the assassin's parting words. "You're not the only one being watched." The walls felt like they were closing in, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. For Leroy, for justice, for the truth. Tomorrow, he would make his next move. And this time, he'd be ready. The air in the Coldridge FBI office was thick with tension as Micah stared at the map pinned to the corkboard in his temporary office. Red circles marked the locations of recent drug drops connected to the Iron Hounds, with Calloway's precinct conveniently positioned in the center. Micah's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. Calloway wasn't just facilitating the trafficking, he was orchestrating it. Sitting across the desk, Janessa Crowell typed furiously on her laptop, decrypting more of the burner phone's messages. The logs revealed dates and locations, but Micah needed more. He needed Calloway to make a mistake, to expose himself. "This is bigger than we thought," Janessa said, her voice breaking the silence. "The Harbinger isn't just a name. It's a code for someone directing operations across multiple states." Micah rubbed his temples, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "We'll deal with the Harbinger later. Right now, Calloway is our way in." Janessa glanced up, concern etched into her features. "What are you planning?" Micah leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "We feed them bad intel, make them think a shipment's in jeopardy. If Calloway's as involved as I think he is, he'll show up to protect his interests." That evening, Micah and Janessa worked late into the night, crafting their bait. They fabricated a report indicating that a major drug shipment was scheduled to pass through the Coldridge Industrial Yard. The message was carefully coded and sent through channels they knew Calloway monitored. Now, all they had to do was wait. As the hours dragged on, Micah paced the room, his mind racing with possibilities. Calloway was dangerous, but desperation could make him reckless. Micah needed that recklessness to flush him out. The trap was set. Micah sat in an unmarked van parked a few blocks from the industrial yard. Through the high-tech surveillance equipment Janessa had rigged, he could see the site clearly. The darkened yard was littered with shipping containers and abandoned machinery, the perfect setting for an illicit deal. "Anything?" Micah asked, his voice low. Janessa, sitting beside him with a headset on, shook her head. "Not yet. But if the messages we intercepted are right, it won't be long." Micah checked his weapon, his fingers brushing against the scar on his wrist, a reminder of the fight that had brought him here. His father's face flashed in his mind, and a familiar fire burned in his chest. This was for Leroy. Hours passed before a convoy of vehicles approached the yard. Through the surveillance feed, Micah saw a black SUV pull up, followed by two vans. The doors opened and men poured out, heavily armed and moving with precision. Among them was Chief Victor Calloway. "There he is," Janessa said, her voice tinged with both triumph and apprehension. Micah's stomach tightened as he watched Calloway step into the floodlights, his authoritative demeanor unshaken, even among the gang leaders. The Iron Hounds were there too, led by their ruthless boss, Roman Grinder Novak. "Let's see what you're up to, Calloway," Micah muttered, adjusting the feed to capture audio. On the ground, Calloway's voice was steady as he addressed Novak. "This shipment better go smoothly. If the feds catch wind of this, it's both our heads." Novak crossed his arms, his face a mask of disdain. "You've got your protection money, Calloway. If anything goes wrong, it's on you." Calloway sneered. "I've kept this precinct clean for you for years. Don't forget who's kept you in business." Micah's fists clenched as he listened. This wasn't just corruption. It was outright treason. Janessa's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We've got enough to move, Micah. Let's take them down." "Not yet," Micah said. "I want Calloway to hang himself." Minutes later, the tension on the ground escalated. Novak's men began unloading crates from the vans, their movements hurried but methodical. Calloway barked orders, ensuring the operation went off without a hitch. But just as they finished, the air was shattered by the sound of approaching sirens. "Damn it," Calloway hissed, drawing his gun. "How did they find us?" Novak turned on him, fury blazing in his eyes. "You set us up." "I didn't," Calloway started, but the accusation hung heavy. Micah smirked from his vantage point in the van. The fake sirens, courtesy of Janessa's tech wizardry, had done their job. The scene was chaos now, with Calloway caught between defending himself and salvaging the operation. "Now we move," Micah said, signaling to the SWAT team waiting nearby. The raid unfolded with precision. Officers stormed the yard, shouting commands as the gang scrambled to fight back. Gunfire erupted, the sound deafening as Micah led the charge toward Calloway. The chief saw him coming and fired, the bullet grazing Micah's shoulder as he dove behind a stack of crates. Pain shot through him, but adrenaline kept him moving. He rolled out, firing a shot that disarmed Calloway. "End of the line, Calloway," Micah shouted, advancing on the man. Calloway lunged, tackling Micah to the ground. The two men grappled, their fists colliding in a brutal exchange. Calloway's strength was surprising, but Micah's determination outweighed it. "You're just like your father," Calloway snarled, landing a blow to Micah's ribs. "Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Micah's rage boiled over. He twisted free, slamming Calloway against a metal container. "You don't get to talk about my father," Calloway smirked through bloodied lips. "He was a good man. Too good. That's why I had to put him down." The confession hit Micah like a freight train, but it only fueled his resolve. He slammed Calloway to the ground, pinning him. "You're done, Calloway. This ends now." As the SWAT team closed in, Micah cuffed the disgraced chief, his hands trembling with both exhaustion and triumph. Calloway's smug expression remained, even as he was dragged away. "You think this changes anything?" Calloway shouted. "You've only scratched the surface. The Harbinger will bury you." Micah stood there, bloodied and bruised, but victorious. For the first time in 20 years, the scales of justice felt a little more balanced. Back at the FBI office, Micah watched from the observation room as Calloway sat in an interrogation cell, his arrogance still intact. Janessa joined him, her expression a mix of relief and unease. "We got him," she said. Micah nodded, but his mind was already racing. Calloway's final words lingered. "The Harbinger will bury you." This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with tension and the hum of whispered conversations. Victor Calloway sat at the defense table, dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted sharply with the charges hanging over his head. His expression was calm, almost smug, as though the trial was merely a formality. To his right, his defense attorney, Marcus Hartley, exuded confidence, a seasoned litigator who thrived in the spotlight. The gallery was packed with reporters, sketch artists, and curious locals who had followed the case since its explosive beginning. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop journalists from feverishly jotting down every detail. Outside, a throng of protesters and supporters alike gathered, their chants and signs reflecting the divided opinions about the man on trial. Micah Gaines sat at the prosecution's table, his gaze fixed on Calloway. The man who had ordered his father's execution was finally facing justice, but Micah knew the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Calloway's defense team had already begun spinning a narrative of victimhood, painting the disgraced police chief as a man forced into corruption by a system that demanded results at any cost. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as everyone rose. Judge Marilyn Carter, a no-nonsense figure with sharp eyes and a firm demeanor, took her seat. "This court is now in session," she announced. "The People versus Victor Calloway." The prosecution opened with a meticulous presentation of the case. Rachel Monroe, the lead prosecutor, laid out Calloway's extensive involvement in the drug ring, the embezzlement of precinct funds, and the cold-blooded murder of Leroy Gaines. She detailed how Calloway had used his position of power to orchestrate crimes while maintaining a facade of integrity. Hartley countered with equal fervor, arguing that Calloway was a victim of circumstance. "The system failed Victor Calloway," he proclaimed to the jury, his voice rich with theatrical gravitas. "This man dedicated his life to serving his community, only to be ensnared in a web of corruption that extends far beyond him. He is not the mastermind here, he is the scapegoat." Micah's jaw clenched as he listened. Hartley's performance was compelling, but it was built on lies. Micah knew that it would take more than evidence to convict Calloway. It would take raw, undeniable truth. When it was Micah's turn to testify, the room seemed to hold its breath. He walked to the stand with measured steps, his back straight, his face resolute. Once sworn in, he met Rachel Monroe's gaze as she approached. "Agent Gaines," Monroe began, her voice steady, "can you tell the court why you pursued this case so relentlessly?" Micah took a deep breath. "Because this case isn't just about corruption. It's personal." "Personal how?" Monroe pressed gently. Micah's voice wavered for a moment before he steadied it. 20 years ago, my father, Leroy Gaines, was murdered. He was a police officer, a good one. He spent his life protecting people, standing up for what was right. And he died because of it." The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Micah. Even Calloway's smug facade seemed to falter. Micah continued, his voice gaining strength. "For years, I believed his murder was a random act of violence. But when I started digging, I found evidence that led me back to Chief Calloway. My father uncovered corruption in the Coldridge precinct, a drug ring that Calloway was running. And when my father got too close to the truth, Calloway had him killed." Monroe nodded, letting the weight of Micah's words settle over the jury. "Agent Gaines, during your investigation, did you uncover any evidence directly linking Chief Calloway to your father's murder?" "Yes," Micah said, his jaw tightening. "Calloway admitted it himself during his arrest. He said my father was too good and had to be dealt with." Hartley stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay." Judge Carter frowned. "Sustained. The jury will disregard that statement." Monroe pivoted smoothly. "Agent Gaines, let's focus on the physical evidence. What did you discover about the financial ties between Chief Calloway and the Iron Hounds? Micah detailed the ledgers, the surveillance footage, and the payments that had flowed through the precinct under Calloway's watch. His testimony was calm, methodical, but every word carried the weight of a son seeking justice for his father. When Monroe finished, Hartley rose for cross-examination. He approached Micah with the air of a predator circling its prey. "Agent Gaines," Hartley began, his tone almost patronizing. "You've been through a lot. Losing a father in such a tragic way, it's enough to cloud anyone's judgment." Micah's eyes narrowed. "My judgment isn't clouded. The evidence speaks for itself." "Does it?" Hartley countered. "Or are you letting your grief drive you? Isn't it possible that your need for closure has made you see connections that aren't really there?" Micah's fists clenched under the table. "The connections are real." Hartley smirked. "You're certain? Even though you have no recording of this so-called confession?" Micah glared at him. "I'm certain." Hartley paced for a moment, letting the tension build. "Tell me, Agent Gaines, have you ever considered that you might be wrong? That perhaps you're chasing a ghost instead of the truth?" Micah's voice was ice. "The truth is sitting right there," he said, pointing at Calloway. The trial continued for weeks, the prosecution and defense trading blows. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and the media ate up every detail. Calloway remained composed throughout, but his confidence began to erode as the prosecution built its case brick by brick. The turning point came on the final day of testimony. Monroe called a surprise witness, a former officer from the Coldridge precinct who had recently come forward. The man, his face pale and his voice trembling, revealed a recording he had made years ago during a meeting with Calloway. The courtroom fell silent as the audio played. "Leroy Gaines is a liability," Calloway's voice said, cold and deliberate. "If he keeps digging, he'll bring us all down. Take care of him." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Calloway's face twisted, his composure finally cracking. The jury stared, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. Monroe turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a man caught in a flawed system. This is a man who used his power to destroy lives, to cover his tracks, and to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. This is not a victim. This is a murderer." When the jury returned with their verdict, the room was electric with anticipation. The foreman rose, his hands shaking slightly as he read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Victor Calloway, guilty on all charges." The gallery erupted, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Micah closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high. As Calloway was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back at Micah, his eyes filled with venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You're just scratching the surface." Micah didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered as Micah stepped into the sunlight. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in 2 decades, he felt the weight of his father's murder begin to lift. Leroy Gaines could finally rest in peace. The courtroom was a whirlwind of activity as the gavel struck for the final time, signaling the end of one of the most high-profile cases Coldridge had ever seen. Victor Calloway had been found guilty on all counts: corruption, embezzlement, drug trafficking, and, most damning of all, orchestrating the murder of Leroy Gaines. A murmur rippled through the gallery as people processed the verdict. Reporters scribbled furiously, eager to capture the historic moment, while others simply sat in stunned silence. Micah remained seated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he absorbed the weight of it all. This victory had come at a high cost, not only for him, but for every person touched by Calloway's corruption. His father's sacrifice had not been in vain, but Micah knew the relief he felt would be temporary. He had glimpsed the vastness of the operation, and as much as he wanted this to be the end, he knew there were still shadows lurking just out of reach. As the guards approached to take Calloway into custody, the former chief fixed Micah with a glare that still held the chilling edge of authority. He held his head high, refusing to let his impending fate diminish his presence. "You think this ends with me?" Calloway's voice cut through the low hum of the crowd, sharp and menacing. His gaze bore into Micah, a hint of satisfaction still flickering in his eyes. "You're just scratching the surface." Micah met his stare, refusing to flinch. He had expected these words, but hearing them out loud left a hollow feeling in his chest. The guards cuffed Calloway and began to lead him away. He continued to smirk, his voice a final, sinister whisper that only Micah could hear. "You'll never reach him. The Harbinger is everywhere, Gaines. You'll never find him." As Calloway disappeared through the side door, Micah's mind replayed those words, a chilling reminder that this victory was only the beginning. The aftermath of the trial swept through Coldridge like a storm. The police precinct, once thought to be a pillar of safety in the community, became the focal point of an extensive investigation. Officers once trusted by their community were suddenly under scrutiny, and every aspect of the department's operations was being examined with a fine-tooth comb. One by one, arrests were made. Men and women who had sworn to serve and protect were revealed as collaborators in Calloway's criminal network. Some had accepted bribes, others had looked the other way, and a few had even participated in the logistics of the Iron Hound's operations. Calloway's takedown had pulled the first thread, and now the entire tapestry was unraveling. Micah watched as the dominoes fell, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. For every officer they arrested, there were hints, encrypted messages, bank transfers, hushed conversations that pointed to an invisible hand guiding them all. The Harbinger. Calloway's words haunted him, whispering of a presence far more elusive than they had yet encountered. In the days following the trial, Micah spent countless hours poring over files and encrypted messages. He slept little, his mind consumed by the unanswered questions Calloway had left him with. Every piece of evidence hinted at a larger network, one that extended beyond Coldridge and perhaps even beyond the state. The Harbinger's name appeared repeatedly, scattered across documents like a shadow that refused to be caught. Janessa Crowell, his loyal partner in this journey, stood by his side, her own determination undiminished by the obstacles they faced. Together, they sifted through data and pored over phone records, searching for any thread that could lead them closer to the truth. "Look at this," Janessa said one evening, her voice tense with urgency. She handed him a printout of a bank statement with a large, unexplained transfer originating from an offshore account. "This account ties back to one of the officers we arrested, but the transaction doesn't add up," she explained. "It was rerouted through at least 5 shell companies before landing in the officer's account. Whoever's behind this is meticulous." Micah examined the document, his mind racing. "They're covering their tracks too well for this to be a simple drug ring. This is organized at a level that even Calloway couldn't reach on his own." Janessa nodded, her brow furrowed. "And if Calloway was just one piece of it, that means the Harbinger is likely running the entire operation." Micah's stomach twisted at the realization. Then we're only seeing a fraction of what they're capable of. A few days later, Micah received a call from Rachel Monroe, the prosecutor who had worked tirelessly to bring Calloway to justice. She sounded both weary and determined as she updated him on the latest developments. "We've identified several more officers and city officials tied to the corruption ring," she said. "It's not just limited to Coldridge. This network has roots in other cities across the state, and possibly beyond." Micah's pulse quickened. "And what about the Harbinger?" Rachel sighed. "We're still digging. Every time we get close, the trail goes cold. Whoever he is, he's hidden himself well, but we'll keep looking." Micah thanked her, but as he hung up, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Calloway's words echoed in his mind, a dark reminder that there was a powerful force still at large. As the weeks passed, Micah continued to unravel the layers of deceit and manipulation Calloway had woven around Coldridge. He and Janessa managed to identify a network of politicians, businessmen, and even judges who had ties to the Harbinger's organization. Each revelation was a victory, but it felt like fighting a shadow that constantly shifted and adapted. One evening, as he sat in his office, Micah's phone vibrated with a new message. The sender was anonymous, and the message contained only a single line. "Leave this alone, Gaines. You don't know what you're dealing with." Micah stared at the words, a chill creeping up his spine. He knew this was no idle threat. The Harbinger's reach was vast, and the message was a clear warning to back down. But Micah had come too far to stop now. His father's legacy was at stake, and justice was a debt he intended to see paid in full. The following day, Micah and Janessa were called to a meeting at the state's Department of Justice headquarters. They entered a sleek conference room where Rachel Monroe was waiting, along with a few high-ranking officials and agents from other jurisdictions who had joined the investigation. "Thank you all for being here," Rachel began. "As you know, this case has grown beyond anything we initially expected. Victor Calloway's arrest and conviction were a major victory, but the presence of the Harbinger suggests a larger network of corruption and criminal enterprise that spans far beyond Coldridge." The room was silent as Rachel laid out the plan. They would form a task force dedicated to dismantling the Harbinger's organization, utilizing resources from multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The stakes were high, but the team was determined. As the meeting concluded, Rachel pulled Micah aside. "You've done remarkable work, Micah," she said, her tone softening. "But I need you to understand what you're up against. The Harbinger is unlike any criminal we've ever pursued. He's careful, calculated, and ruthless. If you go after him, you need to be prepared for anything." Micah nodded, his resolve unshaken. "I've spent my whole life chasing shadows. I'm ready." In the following weeks, Micah and the task force dove headfirst into the investigation. They coordinated raids, intercepted encrypted communications, and uncovered connections to government officials and law enforcement agencies across the region. Each new piece of evidence was a step closer to exposing the Harbinger, but the mastermind remained elusive, his identity hidden behind layers of misdirection and silence. The deeper they went, the more dangerous the mission became. Threats arrived in the form of anonymous notes, tampered evidence, and even suspicious accidents. But Micah pressed on, driven by the promise he had made to his father and to himself. One night, as Micah returned home, he found another note slipped under his door. It was written in the same precise script as the previous messages. "Stop now, or the next funeral will be yours." Micah clenched the note in his fist, the threat igniting a fire in him. He knew the Harbinger was watching, waiting for him to falter. But he had come too far to stop. This was no longer just about justice for his father. It was about dismantling a network that had exploited power, betrayed the public trust, and taken innocent lives. And Micah wouldn't stop until he brought the Harbinger to light, no matter the cost. As he stared into the night, he felt the gravity of what lay ahead. The path he had chosen was dark and dangerous, but it was the only way forward. The morning sky over Silver Willow Lake was painted in soft hues of pink and gold as Micah stepped out of his car, the cold air filling his lungs with each steady breath. The lake was still, its surface mirroring the towering willows lining its banks, creating an atmosphere of tranquility that contrasted sharply with the chaos and violence of recent months. But for Micah, this place had always been sacred, a piece of his past that hadn't been tainted by betrayal or corruption. He walked the familiar path to his father's grave, the crunch of gravel underfoot, echoing in the silence. The headstone stood beneath an ancient willow tree, its branches hanging low as if offering shelter. Leroy Gaines's name was etched into the stone, along with the words, "Beloved Father, Honored Officer." Micah knelt, his fingers brushing over the cold granite, memories flooding his mind. He could almost see his father sitting beside him, fishing pole in hand, the lake stretching out before them. Those days had been simple and safe, a time when Micah had looked at his father with the unshakable faith of a son who believed in heroes. "Hey, Dad," Micah began softly, his voice catching in his throat. He took a deep breath, finding his resolve. "It's over. Calloway. He won't hurt anyone else. We got him." The words felt heavier than he'd expected, each one a release of the burden he'd carried for so long. Leroy's death had haunted him for 2 decades, the question of why hanging over every choice he'd made. And now he finally had the answers, even if they had come at a tremendous cost. "I wish you could see it, Dad. I know you'd be proud. But this isn't the end." Micah looked up, gazing out over the lake. "There's someone else out there. Someone who's been pulling the strings all along. They call him the Harbinger. and I won't stop until I find him. I owe you that much." He was silent for a long time, his eyes tracing the ripples on the lake as if each one held a piece of the story he was trying to tell. The anger and the pain he'd lived with for so long began to ebb, replaced by something softer, a sense of purpose that went beyond vengeance. Micah heard the sound of footsteps behind him, soft and unhurried. He didn't need to turn to know it was Sarah. She'd known where to find him, just as she always did. She moved quietly, stepping beside him and resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, her voice like balm on an old wound. "I thought you could use some company." Micah nodded, managing a small smile. "I was just telling him about everything. About Calloway, the investigation, all of it." Sarah knelt beside him, her eyes warm as they met his. "I think he knows. I think he's proud of you." They sat in silence, the morning light filtering through the willow branches above them, casting dappled shadows over the grave. For the first time in months, Micah felt a sense of peace, a fleeting but profound stillness. He looked at Sarah, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "You'd manage, but I'm glad you don't have to." They both laughed softly, a shared understanding passing between them. In a world full of shadows and deception, she was his anchor, the one person who grounded him. And here, in the quiet embrace of the lake, he felt the pieces of his fractured life beginning to come together. Micah let out a long, steady breath, his gaze returning to the headstone. "I made a promise to him, you know. When I was a kid, I promised I'd follow in his footsteps. Be a good cop. Do the right thing." "And you have," Sarah whispered. "You're keeping that promise every day." Micah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah. I think he'd understand the fight I'm in now. He'd probably warn me to be careful, tell me to watch my back. But he'd understand." The lake remained still, as if listening. In that quiet moment, Micah felt his father's presence, not as a ghost haunting his memories, but as a guiding force, pushing him forward. "I don't know what's next," Micah admitted. "The Harbinger, he's out there." Calloway's words keep echoing in my head. "You're just scratching the surface." It's as if this whole thing was just the beginning. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with both worry and pride. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together. You're not alone, Micah. Not anymore." Micah squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her words. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." They stood together, and Micah cast one last look at his father's grave. "I'll keep going, Dad," he whispered. "For you. For everyone who's been hurt by people like Calloway." As they began to walk back to the car, Micah felt a sense of closure, a door that had remained open for too long finally beginning to close. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready. That evening, back at home, Micah sat in his study, sifting through papers and files, preparing for what lay ahead. He'd barely scratched the surface of the Harbinger's network, but he was already making plans, charting a path forward. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Sarah leaning against the frame, holding a small envelope. "This came for you," she said, her brow furrowing with concern. "No return address." Micah's stomach tightened as he took the envelope, his pulse quickening. He carefully opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper. The words, scrawled in precise, almost elegant handwriting, were chillingly simple. "The Harbinger is watching." Micah's jaw clenched as he read the note, a mix of anger and determination flooding his veins. The Harbinger knew about him, had probably known for a while. But this message wasn't meant to scare him. It was a taunt, a reminder that the fight was far from over. He looked up at Sarah, who had read the expression on his face. "What does it say?" Micah handed her the note, watching as she read the message, her own expression hardening. "They're trying to intimidate you." Micah nodded. "And it won't work. This only confirms that we're getting closer." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we keep going. Together." Micah took her hand, their fingers intertwining. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire that had been reignited by the reminder of the challenges ahead. Leroy's death had left a wound that would never fully heal, but he could honor his father's legacy by continuing the fight. As he looked out the window into the night, Micah felt the weight of his promise settle over him. The Harbinger was watching, but so was he. This time, he wouldn't let the shadows slip away so easily. If you were in Micah's shoes, would you have continued pursuing the Harbinger after bringing Calloway to justice, or would you have stopped, knowing the risks? What would you do? Do you think Micah's father, Leroy, would have wanted him to keep fighting even with the dangers ahead? How far would you go to honor a loved one's memory? With the Harbinger's ominous presence still looming, do you think Micah will ever find peace, or is he destined to remain in the shadows chasing justice? Let us know your thoughts.